The morning mist in the valley usually felt like a warm blanket, but today, for Clara, it felt like a shroud. She stood at her kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. From this vantage point, she could see the main square of the village. It was Saturday, the day of the weekly market, a day that used to be the highlight of her week, just 6 months ago. Clara wouldn't have been able to walk 5 feet in that square without someone stopping her. They would ask for her advice on their gardens, thank her for the soup she'd brought over when their kids were sick, or simply want to bask in her easy, infectious laughter. She was the glue. She was the one who remembered birthdays and the one who organized the holiday fundraisers. But as she watched through the glass, she saw the reality of her new life. Mrs. Gable, a woman Clara had driven to doctor's appointments for 3 years, saw Clara's car in the driveway and immediately adjusted her sun hat. It was a practiced movement, a synchronized dance of avoidance that the whole town had mastered. Clara took a slow breath, the steam from the cold tea no longer rising. The silence in her house was heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a quiet morning. It was the ringing silence of isolation. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it felt like it had. It started with the whispers, small, jagged things that caught in the wind. A disagreement over the local library's funding had been twisted, by a few influential voices, into an accusation that Clara was difficult and self-serving. Then came the social media posts, vague but pointed. Then the invitations stopped. The glue of the community had been dissolved by a few drops of acid, and now Clara was just a ghost haunting her own life. She stepped away from the window. Unable to watch the normalcy of the market any longer, her house, once filled with the sounds of bridge clubs and planning committees, now echoed with the hum of the refrigerator. She walked to the hallway mirror and stopped. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were tired, the spark replaced by a wary, guarded look. "It's just a season," she whispered to the empty room. But even her own voice sounded thin and unconvincing. She decided she couldn't stay inside. She needed milk, and more than that, she needed to prove to herself that she wasn't invisible. She put on her coat, smoothed her hair, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and wood smoke. As she walked down her driveway, she saw her neighbor, a man she had known since childhood, watering his lawn. "Morning, Arthur," Clara said, her voice steady and hopeful. Arthur didn't look up. He moved the hose in a slow, rhythmic arc, focusing intently on a patch of clover. He was close enough to hear her heartbeat, yet he acted as if she were a gust of wind. Clara stood there for a second too long, the silence stretching out like an elastic band about to snap. She kept walking, her face burning. When she reached the market, the sensory overload hit her. The smell of fresh bread, the shouting of the vendors, the barking of dogs. She saw a group of her old friends standing by the fruit stand, women she had shared 1,000 cups of coffee with. She began to wave her hand halfway up before she saw their reaction. It was like a physical wall had been erected. Their conversation didn't stop, but their body language shifted. They turned inward, forming a tight circle, their backs creating a literal barrier. One of them, a woman whose child Clara had tutored for free, glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes met Clara's for a split second. There was no hatred in them, which almost made it worse. There was only a cold, clinical indifference. Clara lowered her hand and tucked it into her pocket. She walked past them, her head held high, though her chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight. She bought her milk from a vendor who lived 2 towns over and didn't know the politics of the valley. He was the only person who smiled at her as she walked home. Clutching the small paper bag, she realized that the world hadn't ended. The sun was still shining, the birds were still singing, and the town was still functioning. But she was no longer a part of the engine. She was a discarded gear, lying in the dirt while the machine hummed along without her. She reached her front door and fumbled with the keys. Just as she was about to go inside, she heard a muffled sound from the bushes near her porch. She paused. It sounded like a whimper, pushing aside the overgrown hydrangea. She found a small, shivering dog, its fur matted, and its ribs showing. It looked up at her with eyes full of terror and a desperate kind of hope. "Oh, you poor thing," Clara breathed, reaching out a hand. The dog didn't pull away. It leaned into her touch. In that moment, Clara felt a tiny spark of something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. She carried the dog inside, closing the door on the town that had turned its back on her. She didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness was the first thread in a completely different tapestry. The town thought they had erased her, but Clara was about to discover that when you have nothing left to lose, you find out exactly who you are meant to be. The shadows lengthened in the house as she cleaned the dog's paws. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the floor, the dog's head resting on her lap. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. It was the beginning of the end of her old life, and the painful, quiet birth of whatever was coming next. The weeks that followed the arrival of the small dog, whom Clara simply called Buddy, didn't bring the grand reconciliation she had secretly hoped for. If anything, the wall between Clara and the town grew taller and thicker. The initial sting of being ignored had turned into a dull, constant ache, like a bruise that never quite heals because life keeps bumping into it. Clara tried to keep her routine. She woke up, fed Buddy, and took him for long walks on the outskirts of town, where she was less likely to run into anyone. She avoided the main grocery store, opting for a dusty little shop on the edge of the county line. It was more expensive and had less variety, but the clerk there didn't know the rumors. He didn't look at her with that mixture of pity and judgment that had become the town's signature expression. Then, the second blow landed. It didn't come with a shout, but with a thin white envelope in her mailbox. The local council, led by people she once considered family, had decided to reevaluate the zoning of the small plot of land Clara's family had owned for 3 generations. It was a technicality, a bureaucratic needle intended to prick her. They were claiming that her small cottage, which doubled as her workshop for her handmade soaps and lotions, was no longer in compliance with Newtown standards. Clara sat at her kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hand. The workshop was her only source of income. Without the ability to sell her goods at the local craft fairs, from which she had already been softly banned, now facing a legal battle to even keep her workspace, the walls felt like they were closing in. She picked up the phone to call an old friend, someone who worked in the town planning office. The phone rang and rang. Finally, it went to voicemail. "Hey, it's Clara," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I just got this letter about the zoning. I'm sure it's just a mistake. Give me a call back when you can." She never got a call back. A few days later, her heater broke. It was the middle of a particularly cold snap, and the house became an icebox within hours. In the past, she would have called Mr. Henderson from down the road. He was a plumber who had always told her, "Clara, for all the times you helped my wife with her garden, you never pay for labor in this house." When Clara called him, his daughter answered, "My dad is. He's really busy, Clara. Probably won't be able to get to you for a few weeks." The girl's voice was flat, coached. "Weeks. But it's below freezing," Clara whispered. "Sorry," the girl said, and the line went dead. Clara spent that night wrapped in 3 layers of blankets. Huddled on the sofa with Buddy, the dog tucked his head under her chin, his small body providing the only warmth in the room. She felt a deep, terrifying sense of vulnerability. She realized then that her friends hadn't just turned their backs on her social life. They were effectively trying to erase her existence. Money was running low. The legal fees to fight the zoning board were mounting before she even stepped foot in a courtroom. She started skipping meals to make sure Buddy had the best kibble. She stopped turning on the lights in the evening, sitting in the dark to save on electricity. One evening, while walking Buddy near the old stone bridge at the edge of the woods, she saw a group of townspeople gathered for a bonfire. She could hear the music and the laughter. She smelled the wood smoke and the grilled corn. These were people she had celebrated with for decades. She saw the man she'd once helped find a job after he'd been laid off. Scary night of labor. They were all there, glowing in the firelight. A circle of warmth that she was no longer allowed to enter. She stood in the shadows, hidden by a large oak tree. For a moment, a wave of pure bitterness washed over her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run into the middle of their circle and remind them of everything she had done. She wanted to demand to know why a few whispers and a misunderstanding had been enough to outweigh years of loyalty. But as she watched, she noticed something. Even within that circle, people seemed guarded. They were laughing, but their eyes were constantly scanning the group, as if checking to see who was in and who might be out next. It wasn't a circle of friends. It was a circle of fear. Clara looked down at Buddy, who was wagging his tail at a squirrel. He didn't care about zoning laws or town councils. He didn't care about her reputation or the money she didn't have. He only cared that she was there. "Don't need them," she whispered, though her heart felt like lead. The lowest point came on a Tuesday. Clara went to the bank to withdraw the last of her savings to pay the retainer for a lawyer. The teller, a young woman who used to go to Clara's Sunday school class, wouldn't look her in the eye. "I'm sorry, Clara," the teller whispered, leaning in so the manager wouldn't hear. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but people are talking about. Well, they're saying it's better if you just move. That things won't get easier if you stay." Clara took her money and walked out into the bright, cold afternoon. She felt like a ghost walking through a town of living people. She felt a strange, light-headed sensation, the kind that comes when you realize the floor you've been standing on for your whole life has finally given way. She went home, sat on her porch, and watched the sun go down. She had no heater, very little food, and a town that wanted her gone. She had reached the absolute bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind through the pines. In that total isolation, stripped of her status, her job, and her friends, a tiny, hard kernel of something new began to form in her chest. It wasn't happiness, but it was a form of peace. They had taken everything they could take. The only thing left was Clara herself. She stood up, walked inside, and began to light a single candle. She didn't know how she would survive the winter, but for the first time, she stopped looking at the window, waiting for someone to come by. She stopped checking the phone for messages that would never come. She was alone. And in that loneliness, she found a strange, quiet strength. She was no longer waiting to be saved by the people who had abandoned her. She was just waiting. She didn't know that the moment that would change everything was only a few days away. She didn't know that the very people who had shunned her would soon be looking to her for their own survival. For now, she just sat in the candlelight, stroking Buddy's fur. And surviving. The rain had been falling for 3 days strata cold. Relentless downpour that turned the valley into a bowl of gray soup. Clara sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick wool coat that had seen better days. The dog, Buddy, was tucked under her chair, his ears twitching at every roll of distant thunder. The town was quiet. Most people were hunkered down inside, avoiding the mud and the chill. Clara preferred it this way. When the streets were empty, she didn't have to see the faces of people who had forgotten her name. She didn't have to feel the weight of their silence. She had spent the last week preparing her soaps in the kitchen. Using the old wood-burning stove since her electricity had finally been cut off, the scent of lavender and cedar filled the small house. A sharp contrast to the damp smell of the world outside. Around 4 in the afternoon, the rain intensified. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a deluge. Clara watched as a small creek at the edge of her property began to swell. It's usually clear water, turning a muddy brown and rushing with a new, violent energy. She decided she needed to move her old truck to higher ground. The driveway was starting to wash away, and if she lost the truck, she truly would be trapped. She whistled for Buddy, threw on her yellow rain slicker, and stepped out into the mess. As she struggled to get the truck started, a sound cut through the roar of the rain. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, metallic screech followed by a dull, heavy thud. It came from the direction of the old stone bridge, the one she had stood near just a few nights ago. Watching the town's bonfire from the shadows, Clara froze. Her first instinct, honed by months of being treated like an outcast, was to go back inside. "It's none of your business," a voice in her head whispered. "They wouldn't come if it were you, but the sound was followed by a faint, high-pitched cry. It sounded like a child. Clara didn't think anymore. She didn't think about the zoning board, the silent treatment, or the empty bank account. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the truck's glove box and began to run toward the bridge, Buddy splashing along behind her. When she reached the bend in the road, her heart stopped. A large, expensive SUV H1 she recognized instantly as belonging to Mr. Miller. It hadn't fallen into the creek, but it had slammed into a massive oak tree at an awkward angle. The front end was crumpled, and smoke was beginning to mix with the steam of the rain. The driver's side door was jammed against the tree. Inside, she could see Mr. Miller slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. In the back seat, a young girl, his granddaughter, was screaming. Her door stuck fast by the pressure of the car's twisted frame. The creek was rising fast. The ground beneath the SUV was softening. If the bank gave way, the car would slide into the rushing water. Clara scrambled down the muddy embankment, her boots slipping. She reached the back door and pulled with everything she had. It wouldn't budge. The girl inside was wide-eyed with terror, her small hands beating against the glass. "Honey, look at me," Clara shouted over the storm. "Look at me. I'm Clara. I'm going to get you out, okay? I need you to move to the other side of the seat now." The girl, recognizing Clara from the days when Clara used to bring cookies to the council meetings, nodded frantically. She crawled across the seat. Clara looked around for something to break the window. She found a heavy, jagged rock half buried in the mud. She took a breath, turned her face away, and smashed the glass. Rain and glass shards sprayed into the car. Clara reached in, cleared the remaining glass with her gloved hand, and lifted the girl out through the window. "Run up to the road. Stay by the big pine tree," Clara ordered, handing the sobbing child over to the safety of the higher ground. Now came the hard part. The smell of gasoline was becoming thick. Mr. Miller was a large man, and he was pinned by the steering column. Clara ran to the driver's side. She could see blood on his forehead. She hammered on the window until it shattered, just as she had done with the back. She reached in and felt for a pulse. It was there, steady, but weak. "Arthur. Arthur, wake up." She screamed, using his first name for the first time in years. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Clara, and for a second the confusion on his face was replaced by a flash of recognition and then shame. "Clara?" he wheezed. "The girl. Is she?" "She's safe. But we have to get you out. The car is sliding." The mud beneath them groaned. Clara grabbed the handle of the door and braced her feet against the tree. She pulled with a strength she didn't know she possessed a strength, born of months of carrying heavy logs for her stove and the sheer adrenaline of the moment. With a sickening groan of metal, the door lurched open a few inches. It was enough. He was dead weight, and the rain made everything slick. They tumbled into the mud together just as a loud crack echoed through the woods. The bank gave way. Clara watched, breathless, as the SUV slid backward, turning over once before splashing into the dark, churning water of the creek. It was gone in seconds. She lay in the mud, gasping for air, her chest heaving. Arthur Miller lay beside her, coughing and clutching his chest. A few yards away, his granddaughter was crying, but she was alive. Clara stood up slowly, her body aching. She went to the girl first, wrapping her in her own yellow slicker. Then she went back to Arthur. She helped him sit up, checking his head wound. "Can you walk?" she asked. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger she had carried for months. He looked at her. Really? Looked at her, through the rain and the blood. "You saved us," he whispered. "Why did you save us?" Clara looked at the place where the car had been, and then back at the man who had tried to ruin her life. "'Cause it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "And because I'm still the person I've always been, Arthur. Even if you all chose to forget who that was." She helped him to his feet. Slowly, a strange procession moved up the road toward Clara's dark, cold house. A broken man, a shivering child, a dog. and the woman the town had tried to disappear as they reached her porch. The headlights of a police car and an ambulance appeared in the distance, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the accident from across the field. Clara stood on her porch and watched as the flashing, blue and red lights cut through the gray afternoon. The moment had passed. The fate she had been resigned to was gone. The silence was finally over, but it wasn't Clara who was screaming. It was the truth, finally coming to light in the middle of a storm. The night of the accident was the loudest night Clara's house had seen in years, yet she felt more detached than ever. The flashing lights of the ambulance cast rhythmic pulses of red and blue against her living room walls. Medics were checking Arthur's head wound, and the little girl was wrapped in a thick, dry blanket, sipping warm broth Clara had heated on the wood stove. The police officer, a man who had avoided eye contact with Clara at the post office for months, stood in her kitchen. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hat held tightly in his hands. He kept looking at the dark house, the lack of electricity, and the single candle burning on the table. He knew why it was dark. Everyone in town knew Clara's power had been cut. "We'll need a statement, Clara," the officer said, his voice unusually soft. "I've told you what happened," Clara replied. She wasn't being difficult. She was just tired. She sat in her old wooden chair, her clothes caked in drying mud, her hair damp and wild. The car skidded. I pulled them out. The car went into the creek. That's all there is. By the next morning, the rain had stopped, but the gossip was moving faster than the storm ever had. In a small town, news of a life saved is powerful, but news of a life saved by the local pariah is explosive. Clara woke up to a sound she hadn't heard in a long time, a knock on the door. Not a tentative tap, but a firm, urgent knock. When she opened it, she found a woman from the church choir standing there. The woman was holding a large casserole dish, her face a mask of nervous twitching.
"Clara,
We heard about what happened with Mr. Miller and the little one. It was so brave of you." Clara looked at the dish, then at the woman. 2 weeks ago, you walked out of the grocery store aisle because I walked into it, Clara said. Her voice wasn't mean. It was just stating a fact. The woman's face turned a deep shade of red. "Things were complicated, Clara. People were saying things. And now they're saying different things," Clara finished for her. "Keep the food. I'm not hungry for charity." She closed the door gently, but firmly. Over the next few days, the shift began to feel like an avalanche. It started with the utility company. A truck pulled into her driveway without her calling them. 2 men jumped out, and within an hour, her lights flickered back to life. They didn't send a bill. They just nodded at her and drove away. Then came the letters. Not the thin white envelopes of legal threats, but colorful cards. Some were filled with apologies. Some were thank you notes from people who weren't even involved in the accident. It was as if the town was trying to bury its shame under a pile of stationery. But the most significant moment happened on Thursday. There was a town hall meeting. Normally, Clara wouldn't have gone. She would have stayed home with Buddy, protecting her peace. But she had received an official summons, not a legal one, but an invitation written by Arthur Miller himself. She walked into the community center wearing her best coat, the one she'd cleaned the mud off of. As she entered the room, the buzzing of voices stopped instantly. It was the same silence she had endured for months, but the quality of it had changed. Before, it was a silence of exclusion. Now, it was a silence of profound, heavy awkwardness. Arthur Miller stood at the podium. He looked older, a large bandage still covering the side of his head. He looked at Clara as she took a seat in the back row. "Before we start the agenda," Arthur began, his voice echoing in the hall, "I have something to say. Most of you know what happened at the bridge. I was the one who led the charge to change the zoning on the North Road. I was the one who suggested we distance ourselves from Clara because it was easier to follow a rumor than to stand up for a friend." The room was so still, you could hear the clock on the wall ticking. "Clara had every reason to stay in her house that night," Arthur continued. "She had every reason to let the water take that car and me with it. But she didn't. She saved my granddaughter, and she saved me. She did it while living in a house we tried to take from her, in the dark, because we let her fall behind. I've spent my life talking about community values, but Clara is the only one who actually lived them when it mattered." He paused. Looking directly at the people in the front rows, the ones who had been the loudest whisperers, "The zoning motion is dropped," he said firmly. A few people started to clap, but Clara stood up. "I don't want a grant," Clara said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "And I don't need a formal apology written on a piece of paper. I spent months walking through this town as a ghost. I watched people I've known for 30 years turn their heads so they wouldn't have to see me. I watched my friends disappear because it was complicated." She walked down the center aisle, her boots clicking on the floor. "You didn't turn your backs on me because I was a bad person," she said, looking at her former friends. "You did it because you were afraid of being the next one people whispered about. You traded your kindness for safety. I'm glad Arthur and his granddaughter are safe. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But don't think a casserole and a vote at a meeting makes us even. Trust isn't a light switch you can just flip back on." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the hall. Outside, the air was cool and fresh. For the first time in a year, Clara didn't feel the weight of the town on her shoulders. She realized that by saving Arthur, she hadn't just saved a life, she had broken the spell they had over her. She no longer cared if they liked her. She no longer needed them to tell her she was a good person. She knew who she was. As she walked home, she saw a few people on their porches. Some waved tentatively. Some looked away, unable to face her. Clara just kept walking. She went home to Buddy, who was waiting by the door. She sat on her porch and looked at the valley. The fate that had been changed wasn't just her bank account or her legal status. It was her heart. She was free. The town wanted to give her her life back. But Clara had already found a better one in the silence. She realized that the moment at the bridge hadn't just changed how they saw her hit, had changed how she saw them. And that was the greatest gift of all. The weeks following the town hall meeting were perhaps the strangest of Clara's life. The valley was in a state of collective making up for lost time. Everywhere she went, people were almost too kind. The grocery store clerk insisted on carrying her bags. The postman spent 10 minutes talking about the weather. The local hardware store sent over a new heating element for her water heater, free of charge. It was a beautiful spring. The frost had finally retreated, leaving behind a vibrant, stubborn green that seemed to mirror Clara's own spirit. But as the town tried to pull her back into the center of the circle, Clara found that she didn't quite fit there anymore. The shape of her life had changed. She sat on her porch one afternoon, watching Buddy chase butterflies in the tall grass. Her workshop was back in full swing. In fact, she was busier than ever. People from 3 towns over had heard the story of the woman at the bridge, and orders for her soaps and lotions were pouring in through her website. She didn't have to rely on the local craft fairs anymore. She was no longer dependent on the whims of her neighbors to pay her bills. There was a light tap on the porch steps. It was a younger woman from the edge of town, someone Clara hadn't known well before. She was carrying a small box of seedlings. "I heard you were looking to expand your herb garden," the woman said, looking a bit shy. "I grew too many lavender starts this year. I wondered if you could use them." Clara smiled, a genuine, soft smile. "I'd love them. Thank you. Would you like some tea?" They sat together on the porch, talking not about the accident and not about the rumors, but about the soil and the sun. It was the first real conversation Clara had had in a year. It wasn't built on old history or social obligation. It was just 2 people sharing a moment. Clara realized that this was how she would rebuild. One person at a time, based on who they were today, not who they had been during the shunning. A few days later, Arthur Miller came by. He looked much better, though. He walked with a slight limp now. He didn't come to talk about town business. He brought his granddaughter. The little girl ran straight to Buddy, who greeted her with a wagging tail. Arthur stood by the garden gate, looking at the house he had almost helped take away. "I'm stepping down from the council, Clara," he said quietly. "I realized I spent too much time trying to manage the town and not enough time being a neighbor. I'm going to spend my time teaching this one how to fish. He nodded toward the girl. That sounds like a good life, Arthur, Clara said. I wanted to ask, he hesitated. The town is planning a ceremony for the 4th of July. They want to give you a medal of bravery. They want you to give a speech. She thought about the silence, the broken heater, and the way her old friends had turned their backs. Then she thought about the small dog at her feet and the lavender seedlings in the dirt. Tell them thank you, Arthur. But tell them no. Arthur looked surprised. No. But they want to honor you. I don't need a medal to know what I did, Clara said gently. And I don't want to be the town's hero just so they can stop feeling guilty about making me their villain. I'm happy right here. I found a peace that doesn't depend on a trophy or a stage. Arthur nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his face. I think I understand. You've grown beyond us, haven't you? I just grew, Clara replied. As they left, Clara felt a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt since she was a child. The fate that had been changed wasn't that she had become famous or rich. The change was that she was finally the master of her own happiness. She spent the rest of the afternoon working in her garden. She didn't look at the road to see who was passing by. She didn't check her phone for messages. She was surrounded by the scent of lavender and the warmth of the sun that evening. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, a group of women from her old bridge club walked by. They slowed down, looking toward the porch, perhaps waiting for an invitation. Clara raised her hand in a polite, distant wave. It wasn't a cold wave, but it wasn't an invitation either. It was the wave of someone who was perfectly content exactly where she was. The women whispered to each other and kept walking. Clara went inside and lit a candle, not because the power was out, but because she liked the glow. She sat at her table and began to write in a journal. She wasn't writing about the betrayal anymore. She was writing about the future. She had learned that the world can turn its back on you in an instant. It can be cruel, and it can be silent. Sometimes the moment that changes your fate is the moment you decide that you are enough. She was the foundation of her own life, and as Buddy curled up at her feet, Clara finally closed her eyes and slept the deep, unbroken sleep of a woman who was no longer a ghost, but the most alive person in the whole valley. The story of the woman they turned their backs on didn't end with a parade. It ended with a quiet house, a blooming garden, and a heart that had been broken, mended, made stronger than it had ever been before. A full year had passed since the night of the storm, and the valley was once again draped in the heavy, humid heat of midsummer. She had stopped measuring her days by what others thought of her and started measuring them by the height of her sunflowers and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was in her workshop, the air thick with the sweet medicinal scent of eucalyptus and peppermint. She was no longer working alone. A young girl from the village, barely out of high school, sat across from her. The girl's name was Lily. She had come to Clara's door months ago, not because of the hero story, but because she felt like an outsider in her own family and didn't know where else to go. Do you ever regret it? Lily asked, her fingers stained green from stripping herbs. Staying here, I mean? After everything they did? Clara paused, her hands hovering over a jar of golden oil. She looked out the window at the road. It was the same road where people had once crossed to avoid her. Now, a small sign stood at the end of her driveway. Clara's botanicals, all are welcome. In the beginning, every day was a regret, Clara said honestly. Her voice was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. I stayed because I was too tired to leave. But then I stayed because I realized that if I left, I'd be taking the person they thought I was with me. I wanted to stay until I found the person I actually am. Lily nodded, taking that in. People still talk about the bridge. They talk like it was a movie. It wasn't a movie, Clara replied, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It was just a choice. Most of life is just a series of choices that no one sees. The bridge was just the only choice they happened to witness. The afternoon was quiet until the sound of a bicycle crunching on the gravel announced a visitor. It was the young girl Clara had saved, the granddaughter of the man who had once tried to ruin her. She wasn't a baby anymore. She was a leggy, energetic child who treated Clara's porch like a second home. She dropped her bike and ran inside, Buddy barking, a happy greeting. "Clara, look what I found," the girl shouted, holding up a smooth, river-washed stone. "It looks like a heart." Clara took the stone, turning it over in her palm. "It does, doesn't it? It's been tumbled by the water for a long time to get that smooth. That's how the best things are made, you know? A little bit of rough water makes them beautiful." The child didn't fully understand the metaphor, but she beamed anyway. She sat on the floor with Buddy, sharing a secret language of pats and tail wags. Later that evening, after the workshop was cleaned and the visitors had gone, Clara took a walk. She didn't head for the woods or the outskirts this time. She walked right into the heart of the village. The town square was busy. People were setting up for a summer festival. A year ago, this sight would have made Clara's stomach knot with anxiety. She would have felt the ghost of the silent treatment lurking around every corner. But as she walked through the square now, something had changed, not just in her, but in the air itself. She saw the woman who had tried to give her the casserole dish a year ago. The woman stopped, hesitated, and then gave a simple, honest nod. Clara nodded back. There was no long conversation, no forced apology. There was just a quiet acknowledgement of shared space. It was enough. Clara realized that her presence in the town had become a sort of mirror. By not being bitter, by not demanding a pedestal, and by simply continuing to be kind on her own terms, she had forced the townspeople to look at their own reflections. Some had changed for the better. Others were still uncomfortable. But they all respected the boundaries she had built. She reached the old stone bridge. The repairs were finished, the stone looking newer and stronger than before. The creek below was low and sparkling in the twilight, a far cry from the monster it had been during the storm. She stood there for a long time watching the water. She thought about the woman who had stood here in the rain, terrified and alone. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for that woman. She was grateful for her fear, grateful for her loneliness, and even grateful for the people who had turned their backs. Without that darkness, she never would have discovered the light she carried inside herself. A car slowed down as it passed the bridge. The driver waved. Clara didn't recognize him. He was likely a tourist or someone new to the area. She waved back anyway. To him, she was just a woman on a bridge, enjoying the evening. She wasn't a hero, wasn't a victim, and wasn't an outcast. She was just a person. And that, she decided, was the greatest fate of all. She walked back to her house, the one with the lights blazing and the workshop full of life. She had turned the back of a town into the foundation of a home. As she stepped onto her porch and heard Buddy's muffled woof from inside, she knew that the story didn't end with happily ever after. It ended with peacefully ever after. She closed her door, and for the first time in her life, she didn't lock it because of fear. She locked it simply to keep the warmth in. The seasons in the valley had a way of blending into one another. But the winter of the second year felt different. It wasn't the biting, lonely cold Clara had experienced when the town had turned its back on her. Instead, it was a quiet, shared season. The snow fell softly, coating the pine trees in white. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara felt a sense of belonging that didn't require her to be anything other than herself. One Tuesday morning, it wasn't a stranger or a curious tourist. It was a man named Thomas, a local carpenter who had been one of the most vocal critics of Clara during the time of Whispers. He stood on the porch, his cap in his hands, his breath blooming in the cold air. "Clara," he began, looking at his boots. "My son is starting a small business. He's making wooden crates for shipping goods. He told me he wouldn't even think of asking anyone else for their business until he asked you first." Clara looked at Thomas. She remembered the day he had walked out of a town meeting specifically so he wouldn't have to sit in the same row as her. She saw the shame still flickering in his eyes, but she also saw something else, a genuine desire to fix what had been broken. "Tell him to come by tomorrow, Thomas," Clara said kindly. "I'd rather buy crates from a neighbor than a big company anyway." Thomas looked up, a look of immense relief washing over his face. "I also wanted to say that we're fixing the old community hall. We're putting up a wall of photos. Faces of the Valley, we're calling it. We'd like yours to be the first one people see when they walk in." Clara leaned against the doorframe, the cold wind nipping at her cheeks. "Thomas, you know I don't care for photos on walls. But if you want to put a photo of my garden there, or maybe a photo of Buddy, you're welcome to it. Let the people see the work, not just the face." He laughed, a short, dusty sound. "I figured you'd say that. You haven't changed a bit, have you?" "I've changed completely," Clara replied with a wink. "I just haven't changed the parts you were looking at." As the winter progressed, Clara noticed a shift in the town's behavior. It wasn't just about her anymore. She saw people helping the elderly man down the street whose house had fallen into disrepair. She saw the grocery store clerk giving a break to a young mother who was a few dollars short at the register. In its place, a small, fragile circle of genuine care was beginning to grow. Clara realized that her refusal to be a victim and her refusal to be a vengeful hero had given the town permission to be human again. She had allowed them to move past the guilt that usually keeps people from being kind. One evening, she sat by her fireplace with Buddy. The dog was older now, slower in his movements. But his eyes were as bright as the day she had found him in the bushes. She realized that her fate hadn't just been changed by the moment at the bridge. It had been changed by the thousands of small moments that followed the moments where she chose to say yes to a neighbor. The moments where she chose to keep her door open. And the moments where she chose to let go of the past. She picked up a pen and finished the last page of her journal. The final entry wasn't about the people who turned their backs. It wasn't about the cold or the darkness. It read, "They didn't just turn their backs on me. They turned their backs on their own hearts. When I saved them, I wasn't just saving their lives. I was giving them their hearts back. And in doing so, I found my own." The next morning, the sun rose over the valley, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Clara stepped out onto her porch, a steaming mug of tea in her hand. She looked down toward the village square. She could see the smoke rising from the chimneys, the school bus making its rounds, and the life of the town moving forward. She was no longer the center of their drama. She was no longer the person they talked about in hushed tones. She was just Clara. She was the woman who made the good soap, the woman who had the brave dog, and the woman who always had a seat on her porch for anyone who needed to talk. She was a part of the valley, as permanent and as quiet as the stone bridge itself. The story was over, but the life was just beginning. Clara took a sip of her tea, felt the warmth spread through her chest, and smiled at the horizon. She had survived the silence, conquered the storm, built a world where no one would ever have to feel invisible again. As she turned to go back inside, she saw a small group of children walking to school. They waved at her, their faces bright and unburdened by the history of their parents. Clara waved back, her heart full and her spirit at rest. The woman they turned their backs on was gone. In her place stood a woman who had turned her face to the sun and refused to look away.